Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 8th session of the Nāgārjuna Karika reading group. And for this session, we're reading 3 chapters, or discussing 3 chapters. And that's chapters 12 through 14, an analysis of suffering, an analysis of the composite or compounded, an analysis of conjunction or contact. So let's start with an analysis of suffering. So I'm going to read a little bit from the commentary. The second of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths proclaims that suffering originates in dependence on causes. The question raised here is the following: how is suffering related to its cause? Is it self-caused? Is it caused by something distinct from itself? By both or by neither? Beginning in verse 4, the opponent introduces the hypothesis that it is caused by a person. Then the hypothesis that it is self-caused becomes the view that it is caused by the person who experiences it in this life, while the alternative is that it is caused by someone else in a distinct life. Since all the Abhidharmikas, save the Buddhalavadins, claim that the person is only conventionally real, is a mere conceptual fiction, this opponent must be a Buddhalavadin. Buddhalavada claims that it is absurd to hold that there could be suffering without someone who feels it. The first and second hypotheses, that suffering is self-caused or other-caused, are discussed in some following verses. So this kind of reminds me a little bit about the idea of the appropriator, that there must be someone who is the subject of appropriation, the one who's doing the appropriating. And here it's very similar structurally, but on the basis of suffering. So there must be a person who suffers. So I guess we're going to analyze it in very much the same way, using a lot of the same formulaic methods of investigation. So let's start from the first verse. So the first verse is really cool because it's very succinct, and like some of the other chapters, it sort of lays out the conclusion at the very beginning. 1. Some say that suffering is self-made, some that it is made by another, some that it is made by both, and some that it is without cause. But it is not correct to think of suffering as an effect. So basically going to analyze all these 3 different aspects of the tetralemma with regards to suffering. And we'll find that none of the categories will be able to ground suffering, and the person who suffers is ultimately real. So verse 2 basically goes over the idea of suffering being self-caused. So 2, if it were self-made, then it would not be dependent, which is absurd. For these skandhas originate dependent on those past skandhas. So the way I understood this verse, along with help from the commentary, was that since the skandhas or the aggregates were taken up, were appropriated, and that they're said to be the nature of suffering, the aggregates that we take as me or mine, then if suffering were self-caused, while also suffering being dependent upon taking up the aggregates, this will also imply that the aggregates are also self-caused, which in turn suggests that suffering is actually permanent, because if they're self-caused and existed by their own nature, and not dependent, then they're sort of always operating in that way. So they're always in the mode of suffering. But this seems to contradict the Buddha's third noble truth, that there is a cessation to suffering. So this idea that suffering is self-caused, which implies that the aggregates that are taken up are also self-caused, ends up actually undermining one of the other key features of the Buddha's noble truths. So we have to reject that. Verse 3 goes over the other possibility, which is that suffering is caused by another. So 3, if these were distinct from those, and those are other than these, then suffering would be produced by another, for these would be made by those others. And I think the commentary is really good to explain this. The hypothesis here is that the suffering that is made up of the present skandhas is caused by distinct skandhas in the preceding life. This is a way of understanding what it would mean for suffering to be made by another, that is, caused by something distinct from that very suffering. According to Chandrakirti, the argument against this is that a causal relation between distinct things is never seen. In support of this, he cites a later verse. The argument will be that if cause and effect were distinct, then anything could be the cause of anything else, so that we can just as well make a pot from a pail of milk as from a lump of clay. So I really like this last sentence that if cause and effect are distinct, then anything could be the cause of anything else. And I've seen this basically being one of the main reasons used for whenever we were discussing production by another. When we try to articulate something as being produced or caused by something very distinct from it, sort of essentially intrinsically distinct from it, then we really have no basis to sort of create that necessary connection between the two things. So then we can just as much say that, you know, it could, whatever is the effect can also be arisen or caused by something completely different that we don't associate it with.
So then I know that some Buddhist philosophers like Dharmakirti, for example, seem to make an attempt to get around this by saying that a thing's causal power, that is its nature of being connected causally to some effect, is its very intrinsic nature. Like the svabhava of a thing is merely that it produces this other thing. But then this would seem to just immediately fall into the other argument. I forget its name. It's one of the like great arguments of the middle way or whatever, not diamond slivers, but the next one in the list of whatever, however many they are. I'll tell you the name in 1 second. I have it written down because I think that a lot of things end up falling into this argument actually. The refutation of production from existent or non-existent. This is the name of this argument. I think that if you say that a thing's very nature is its productive capacity, then you fall into this argument of the refutation of production from existent or non-existent, because the argument here in this one is essentially that if you think a thing's productive nature is its intrinsic nature, and that's all that it is, then it exhibits no intrinsic nature while it exists, because it doesn't stand in any relation to any real thing that has been produced while it is around, because the thing that it's supposed to produce isn't around yet. And if you think then that it bears its intrinsic nature once the thing that is produced is around, then Nāgārjuna draws on the momentariness doctrine, which Abhidharmakas also accept, to say, well, then that thing which you're attributing an intrinsic nature to doesn't exist anymore. So how can it have an intrinsic nature? It doesn't even exist.
Cool. So you're basically saying that this supposed thing whose intrinsic nature is to produce, when it exists and it's not producing, it sort of doesn't exist. But when it produces a thing that does exist, it also doesn't exist.
Exactly. When it's that's why it's called the refutation of production from existent or non-existent. Because when it's existent, it isn't producing, so it doesn't bear that intrinsic nature you're applying to it. When it's non-existent, it's non-existent, so it doesn't bear any intrinsic nature.
Yeah. It's interesting. And Dharmakirti comes after Nāgārjuna, right?
Yes.
And so how do they sort of deal with this Madhyamaka view? If coming after, they would have to integrate it, wouldn't they?
So honestly, Madhyamaka doesn't get interrogated very much at all by much of anyone really, after Asanga, who just kind of blips it. He gives a little bit of an argument against, his argument is basically, this is all his argument is. And Bhaviveka thinks that this argument actually comes from misunderstanding. So Bhaviveka responds to this, but then I don't think there's a response to Bhaviveka's response. But Asanga basically says, if emptiness is something that you're characterizing, that you're like, if emptiness is something you're predicating over objects for, then you're implicitly committed to there being an object that can be empty, which has its reality prior to its emptiness in order to be the kind of thing that can be empty. Thus, emptiness can't be understood as being entirely insubstantiality, but rather emptiness must be understood in Asanga's way, which is existing, but not in the way that it appears. And Asanga makes this argument. Bhaviveka thinks that this misunderstands what the Madhyamaka is doing when they say things are empty. Bhaviveka responds that the Madhyamaka is not saying that things are empty in order to quantify a real predicate, in order to like, apply a quantifier over some domain of objects taken to be real and then predicate over them with an equally real predicate, emptiness.
Right.
But then aside from this exchange, there is very little engagement with Madhyamaka until that is between, because the Dharmakirti was a yogacara. Aside from this little thing, until say really like Shantarakshita, there doesn't seem to be a ton of interaction or dialogue between Madhyamaka and Yogacara in the interim centuries after Asanga and Bhaviveka have this exchange. So the Dharmakirti, I don't think really makes a response to the argument from production of existence or non-existence.
Well, it's funny what you just said about Asanga's critique and Bhavivika's sort of refutation of that critique. Actually, in the next chapter, there's something very similar that Nāgārjuna points out as like a hypothetical objection from an opponent who basically says the same thing, that like, oh, well, if nothing's empty, then there can be nothing that's empty. If everything's empty, there can be nothing that's empty.
Right.
And then it's clarified that like that's based on a misunderstanding of emptiness as being an intrinsic essence, which if you think that's what it is, then it is incoherent. But emptiness is not also ultimately real. It's just sort of the ultimate reality of conventional phenomena. So it's interesting that
the act of predicating over things and saying that they are empty is more of it cannot be taken itself to be an ultimately true statement, right, but rather is just a conventional statement which points out of the conventional in some sense almost.
Yeah. It's interesting that there's especially with all of these hypothetical interlocutors, Nāgārjuna is constantly anticipating all of these all the various possible refutations of his views, and it's interesting that you'll still have people trying to use the same arguments against him, the very ones that he already anticipated. So it's kind of funny to me. But maybe those older Buddhists don't benefit from the accumulative commentaries that like we can benefit now from. So that's with other causation.
The other thing is, another reason why there might have not been much dialogue is that there seems to be a connection between Madhyamaka and Buddhism in South India and Yogacara and Buddhism in North India, especially Northwest India. So it may also be that Madhyamikas were not very proliferated among North Indian Buddhists as much. The other thing is then there eventually becomes sort of a weird situation between Nalanda and Vikramashila, where Vikramashila was more like Yogacara with incorporating Madhyamaka elements, and Nalanda was the opposite, ended up being like Madhyamaka with incorporating Yogacara elements. But then of course Vikramashila survived much longer than Nalanda did. So if you look at the late period of Indian medieval Buddhism, it's so centered in Bengal, which is where Vikramashila was, and in sort of heavy focus on Yogacara, and thus on, well, taking causality to be ultimately real, because that was, even though there were tensions involved in doing this, and so some people ended up accepting a Madhyamaka critique of causality as ultimately real and even subordinating their own Yogacara position as a result of that. In general, the medieval Yogacara tendency to accept that things do have an intrinsic nature, which is their causal power, and that emptiness refers to not seeing them as, not like them appearing different than they actually are. That is their appearance obfuscating their purely causal, dependently origin nature, which is real causal dependence, as opposed to the kind of conceptual dependence that Madhyamikas think. Ended up becoming fairly common in the end of medieval Indian Buddhism, right around the time when Madhyamaka was becoming really popular in Tibet.
Right. Yeah. And that's when Madhyamaka studies really kind of like blows up.
Right. Exactly.
In Tibet. Yeah.
Exactly. This kind of Middle Ages period. It's really interesting how that happened, right? That as Buddhism in India is like moving almost in a way that seems like very distant from Madhyamaka. At the very same time, Prasangika, Chandrakirti is first getting translated into Tibetan around this time, actually. Like Madhyamakavatara was translated in the 12th century, which is around this time period when Yogacara was very predominant.
I think I read recently, I think it was Shantarakshita who actually helped translate some of the texts?
Not Chandrakirti, but I think
No, I mean Shantarakshita.
Shantarakshita didn't, yeah, I'm saying Shantarakshita didn't help translate Chandrakirti, but Shantarakshita did help translate most of the sutras.
Oh, okay.
Is what Shantarakshita's involvement was translated.
Your background is Shantarakshita, isn't it?
No, my background is Dignaga.
Oh, okay. Okay, never mind. Hard to tell. Is he like holding a Vajra or something?
He is not actually. He's doing the point of order posture for debating.
Oh, okay.
Like he's debating with someone and he's trying to give a point of order. That's what he's doing.
Wait, is that before the clap?
Yeah.
Right. Cool. Cool. Okay.
Yeah. So I think this argument is cool because even if you try to get around it by bringing causality back in as an intrinsic nature, like as an intrinsic nature rather than as a, like, I don't know, the exact way that it's explained here is like as two distinct things. So two distinct things somehow being nebulously connected, even if you phrase it as, no, it's one thing, which I'm going to say is of the nature to produce the other thing. Even if you try and do this, you end up just falling into a different Madhyamaka argument.
Mm-hmm. So verse 4, I think we're on now. If suffering is made by persons themselves, then who is that person without suffering, by whom suffering is self-made? And this is like an interesting argument. It's kind of like basically saying, well, if the person who is, so the person who sort of appropriates the aggregates, by doing so, they're in the nature of suffering. And so by saying that suffering is made by the person themselves, because they take up the aggregates which are in the nature of suffering, this almost seems to imply, this almost seems to be another version of the self-caused argument. That's how I'm sort of interpreting it. Yeah, and it's sort of, yeah, instead of saying that suffering itself is self-caused, you're saying that the person who suffers is self-caused. But then if the person who suffers is self-caused, and they're also saying that the suffering itself is self-caused. And so we're sort of back to, sort of trying to wiggle their way around the critique on verse 2, but seems like the same arguments apply. You can't have the self-causation. And I think verse 5 is similar. Now again, it's a person who, but it's another person who causes suffering. And in another way, this is also another iteration of verse 3 of the other cause of suffering. So it's interesting where verse 2 and 3, we're sort of analyzing suffering itself as either self-caused or other cause. And in verse 4 and 5, we're analyzing the person who suffers as either being self-caused or caused by another person who suffers. But those sort of seem like additional elaborations of what's essentially the same points we find in 2 and 3. Actually, I want to read a little bit the commentary for verse 5. The problem that, actually let me read the verse. If suffering of person Y is made by another person X, then how, suffering having been made by that other person X, would there be this person Y without suffering to whom that suffering is bestowed? The problem Nāgārjuna brings up, so this is a commentary, the problem Nāgārjuna brings up is that suffering can't be bestowed on someone who doesn't exist. In order for it to be possible for X to give something to Y must exist prior to the giving. And if someone exists before the suffering is bestowed, then that person exists without suffering. This contradicts the Pudgalavadin position that the person is named and conceptualized in dependence on the skandhas and hence on suffering. Yeah, I think that seems pretty self-explanatory that if one thing prior to another is sort of causing something to that other, we can't really say that that's happening because that other doesn't exist yet. Verse 6, if suffering is generated by a distinct person, who is this distinct person who, while without suffering, having made it, bestows it on another? She didn't write anything on my notes for that one, so. Oh, I think so. I think this actually follows a little bit with verse 7, which I'll read. The self-made being unestablished, how can suffering be made by another? For the suffering the other made would surely be self-made with respect to that other. Well, yeah, so the way I understand these two verses 6 and 7, along with this, with the help of the commentary, of course, is that, so let's say let's say we say that suffering is caused by another, but then we sort of ask, well, if so, this other person who's also the locus of suffering, are they self-made or other caused? And if we say self-made, then we're basically undermining our own initial position that suffering is other made. But if we say it's other made, then we sort of have an infinite regress of other persons making other persons suffer. And at no point can we actually ground this exchange of suffering happening. Unless, of course, we stop it at somewhere with self-made. But like I just said, at that point, we're refuting our own initial position that suffering is caused by another. And I guess one way to try to wiggle your way out of that is by saying, okay, there's both self-caused and other causation. And that's sort of analyzed in verse 9, along with the fourth limb of the tetralemma, that suffering is neither self-caused or caused by another. And the problem with these two is that, and it was just typical of like how Madhyamakas, I've noticed, deal with the category of the third limb of the tetralemma, the both and category, which is that one, it just inherits the defects of the first two limbs. And that also what you're trying to do is hold two contradictory positions simultaneously, which also is incoherent. And neither, that there's neither suffering caused by oneself or another. You're basically saying that suffering isn't caused at all. And this contradicts another of the noble truths, which is the second noble truth, that there's a cause to suffering. So I think this is interesting to point out that every time the opponent tries to ground suffering and the one who is suffering is ultimately real, in the interest of making sense of the Buddhist path, by implication, they actually undermine key parts of the Buddhist path in doing so by positing this intrinsic nature. And then verse 10, which I think is actually super interesting, is that we have a generalization of all of these arguments against the intrinsic nature of suffering to all external objects.
Right. I thought that was interesting too. I wish there was more on that.
Yeah. So I'll just read that. Not only can suffering not be found under any of the four possibilities, external objects also cannot be found under any of the four possibilities. Yeah, I'll read the commentary. It might help a little bit. So according to Buddha Palita, the argument against external objects would go as follows. Matter is either caused by itself or by something distinct, or by both, or else it is uncaused. But matter cannot be self-caused, since nothing is. Matter cannot be caused by something else distinct, since that would be self-made, and so forth. And we can draw out that matter can't be both caused by itself and another because of the defects of the first two limbs and the fact that it's a contradictory position. Nor can we say neither, because to the extent that we're talking about things that exist, Buddhism does not accept non-causation. So that's interesting. So basically, I guess what we sort of get here by the end of this chapter is that what we're really sort of analyzing is this relationship of causation.
So much of it ends up coming down to that, and I think that
Yeah.
I think that so much of it either comes down to the relation of inherence or the relation of causation. The relation of inherence is relevant because of Gullavadins, seeing a person as a locus into which these sort of properties of a person are inhering, while also while also trying to avoid calling it ultimately real. And the causality is important because of other kinds of non-emptiness accepting Buddhist schools that that instead of doing this kind of framing around a person, instead have this causal framing where they take things to be ultimately real because they take them to be standing in ultimately real causal relations. And so a lot of it ends up collapsing down to one of these two relations and whether either of these relations can be ultimately real.
Yeah.
And then just providing different examples for this.
Totally, and especially so a lot of things, go back to the very first chapter, analysis of conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So which makes sense why that was the first. And maybe you could agree with me, but it's almost as if maybe there's other ones too that I have to think about, but it seems like there are a few chapters that you really need to get the essence of what's actually being taught here with this entire text. But of course, because just on the one hand, just to be as exhaustive as is possible, we're looking at all these different aspects of the Abhidharmic view to just really flesh out that view.
Right.
And I guess also just to sort of continue to work with the human tendency to just want to wiggle their way around these arguments and find some way to ground an intrinsic nature of some kind. So, yeah.
Give me 1 second. I have to actually go take a call really fast.
Okay.
I'll be right back. I'll be a few minutes.
Okay. Actually, if you don't mind, Gregor, I think I'll just pause here and just wait for Sagar. Oh, I'm curious. So what's your experience with reading your text? Because I know you're reading this. I forget which translation. Slovenian.
Yes, Slovene. Yeah. Well, when I was a child in primary school, we were taught that we speak Slovene. And nowadays. Practically always I encounter not Slovene anymore, but Slovenian. So I guess obviously officially it's Slovenian now, but whatever.
And you said that particular text draws a lot from the Siddhis and Katsura, right?
Basically, they took this original Sanskrit verses from there. It's this. It has similar like Siddhis and Katsura. It has both Sanskrit original and the Slovene translation of it, like this, for example.
Right, yeah.
The difference would be that at Siderit and Kasura, there is usually commentary along each single verse, and here they first present the verses, and only after all the verses the commentary starts.
Oh. So I'm kind of interested. Is there somewhat of a presence of Buddhism in Slovenia?
Yeah, there is actually a few weeks ago there was as part of one conference here that takes place every year in this time. There was one panel in English. It was In Search of Buddha, because it's this 2,500 years anniversary of Buddha's death, and this panel was yeah, it was 2 days long, and mainly in this panel the participants were the very most of them were analytical philosophers from the Department of Philosophy, which is quite interesting. And as part of this panel, there was also a conversation with the first Tibetan Buddhist Lama here in Slovenia. Yeah, they also have a monastery or some place where. And 2 days before this panel, there was basically also as part of this conference, but just 1 day before the conference actually started, in one village not far from Ljubljana, there was also a conversation with the first Theravada monk, first Slovene Theravada monk, and they also have a monastery in one village. Let's say I don't know, half an hour from Ljubljana, somewhere where 6 monks live in one forest at the edge of one village, and I went to all this. I mean,
Oh, cool.
yeah, and it was quite interesting.
Do they speak Slovene?
Who?
The monks
Which monks?
in the monastery you're talking about.
Ah, yeah, I actually was lucky that when this conversation happened, I went there with the professor of Asian philosophies from the department for philosophy, and she asked me there where the meeting took place if I would be able to go with her when she took the 2 monks back to the monastery, because they have a certain rule that they are not allowed to be alone with her in the car, you know. Yeah, so and I said yes, of course, and so I actually so that place. And sorry, what was the question?
Oh, I just asked if any of the monks you've seen actually in Slovenia actually speak Slovene.
Yes, one of them is Slovene, as I said. Others are from other European states.
Oh, okay, sure. I guess that there are European-born monks too. I was thinking like any because of this. It's interesting seeing how Buddhism has spread beyond Asia and different places, and you know, there are some places that kind of surprised me that has a huge Buddhist presence. Like Brazil has a very big Buddhist presence actually, and I guess Italy is really big too with the Dzogchen community, I believe, and I think there's a lot in Germany as well. And then it's interesting how like the main one of the main people in the lineage that I'm a part of, Chogyal Nongkai Norbu, it's interesting. He learned Italian. He's like as a Tibetan monk. So he like I just find that so interesting. As all these different teachers and monastics like learning the language of wherever they're based on. So I was just curious if if there are any Asian teachers in Slovenia who learn Slovene in order to communicate in that language.
I only know that they do come from time to time, at least to these Tibetan Buddhists that are also here in Ljubljana somewhere. But I'm not sure if there's any actually constantly all the time here.
Okay, I see. Maybe not yet.
So I didn't say maybe not yet.
Yeah, maybe in the future there'll be more of a presence, and then they'll have actually people living full time in Slovenia who are like Tibetan monks. Maybe.
Maybe actually both of these that I mentioned, this Theravada monk and the Tibetan Buddhist nun, the Lama, both of them said that before this pandemic, they spent approximately 6 months in a year here and 6 months in a year in this Theravada monk in Sri Lanka, I think, and the nun in somewhere near Dharamsala. But this epidemic quite interrupted these regular ways of people, and so.
I just randomly thought
I'm
that
back,
like,
by
okay. I just randomly thought maybe in the future Buddhist teachers don't need to necessarily learn the language of wherever they're based in, because once we have like advanced AR goggles that everyone wears that will do live translations in your ear, that would be really interesting for the teaching of the Dharma. I will say there's so many interesting Dharma talks that I find online that I sometimes struggle to get through because there'll be translations happening. Even if it's in English, for example, there's a lot of really good Alexander Berzin talks on YouTube, but a lot of them are in Russia. So he'll have like one paragraph he'll see in English, and then the same paragraph in Russian, and definitely amazing and convenient for Russians who can't speak English well, but hard for me to listen to what's like what's already like a 2-hour video, and 1 hour of it ends up being just like this other language I don't understand. But anyway, random side note.
Just one more thing. Yeah, this Theravada monk also translates from Pali canon to Slovene, and for example, this is Dhammapada that he
Okay, cool.
translated in Slovene. It was translated by someone else even before this, but this professor that I mentioned said this new translation is better.
Something else I thought about, well, when you were talking about how all of the people in that conference are analytic philosophers, it's interesting seeing how, and I guess this might be specific to Madhyamaka, how it really draws the attention of analytic philosophers in the West, and really interested in that. I'm always wondering about are there any, there are a few, but I'm interested in like any like major continental sort of approaches to Madhyamaka. How would that work? You know,
I find it quite weird actually, because if anything, Nyaya is basically an extremely similar project to that of analytic philosophy. And I think, in fact, does many of the things that analytic philosophers are trying to do, perhaps even better than analytic philosophy, like for example, in epistemology even. So I really find it funny that Nāgārjuna, the primary opponent of Naiyayikas, who are clearly, I think, more like analytic philosophers, gets a bunch of attention from analytic philosophers. But analytic philosophy is fairly diverse. So even if it's true that in general, analytic philosophers are realists and, you know, foundationalists about epistemology and so on, they're not all that way. And I guess the ones that aren't, the fringe anti-realists, like, I don't know, end up liking Madhyamaka for that reason. I don't know.
Interesting. I guess what's interesting about the continental tradition generally, I think there, it's a really broad stroke, and so it's probably not completely accurate, but I think there's a lot more sensitivity in like the dependence of all of our metaphysical conceptions and ideas on social relations, power relations, and discourse analysis, which I feel like also resonates a lot with Madhyamaka, in at least in its conclusions, you know, about not forgetting that all of our posits are not, you know, reflections of ultimately real things, but they're bound up in social practice and underlying values, which, you know, give those concepts their meaning and power. But not a lot of the, you know, dry analytical stuff that, you know, but at the same time, you know, there's something to be said about how, you know, Buddhist philosophy, maybe Eastern philosophy in general, can't really be divided into these like analytic versus continental divides, which is a very specifically Western kind of product.
Especially because there's really nothing like continental philosophy. Like, okay, I haven't read a lot of continental philosophy, but continental philosophy, as I have seen it, the little bit that I've seen, there is nothing like this in India. There's nothing that is like continental philosophy in India. There is quite a bit that is like analytic philosophy in India, and there is quite a bit that is like pre-continental, continental European philosophy, things like early modern European philosophy, or, you know, scholastic medieval European philosophy, or even ancient European philosophy, like ancient Greeks. There's a lot of stuff like this in India, but like, there is nothing like Husserl or Heidegger in Indian philosophy. It simply is not a thing. I think in part because Indian philosophical activity emerges so much in a context of debate. And continental philosophy, it's like the philosophizing is designed to not be the kind that you could debate about.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's true. Though I'm curious. I haven't actually looked into it, but I'm curious about this supposed dialogue between Heidegger and Japanese Zen thinkers. I haven't actually quite looked into it, but it's interesting. Something that another sort of maybe baseless connection I've made is, it's interesting how like on the philosophical side, you have this dialogue between Heidegger and these Japanese monks. And then politically, Japan and Germany would align as like the Axis powers. And the fact that Heidegger is also Nazi, and the fact that there have been critiques of the way in which Zen was deployed and exploited to further the sort of Japanese imperialistic sort of regime. So interesting connection there.
The Japanese philosophers who I think are most influenced by Heidegger, while also drawing on Mahayana Buddhism, were like the Kyoto school people. But like what's really interesting about the Kyoto school people is most of them like survived the war and seem to have very much, some of them were actually already anti-imperialist from the beginning, because they were like, there was like a Marxist wing of the Kyoto school actually.
Oh, okay.
But then interestingly, others ended up initially not like being pro-empire, and then like radically changing their perspective and writing about their radical change of perspective after the war, on, I guess, the war and on Japanese imperialism. So I wonder if even you could deploy then some of that against the kind of Zen nationalism, like the writings of the post-war. Because the thing is, the actual like group, the Kyoto school, like the movement, as in the people all gathering at Kyoto University to talk about this stuff, which is what created the Kyoto school in that sense, didn't start until after the war. So you are honestly looking at each of these individual thinkers. You're looking at each of the individual thinkers separately before the war, and then after the war when they met each other, and then their products after that. With some of them being like more left-wing, others more right-wing, and then coming together and ending up being kind of shifting towards, in large part, an anti-imperialist position in the Kyoto school.
Cool, that's interesting. So I should read more about that before I think too far.
I saw one lecture online earlier this year about this Kyoto school, where there was, explained that there are still some people that blame those philosophers for their imperialism, fascism, or whatever. But the man explained that it was difficult in those times to not be like that, because that would have serious consequences for these philosophers and their families. So
I'm gonna link this interesting paper I read a while back, and it was like a good couple of years ago, so I can't remember much of it at all. All I remember is very interesting, and I'm gonna want to return to it. It's actually this analysis of Nishida's concept of nothingness, criticized by this Marxist thinker, who basically says that there's a connection between the way that Marx analyzes commodity fetishism and the way that Nishida apparently fetishizes nothingness. So I think Gregor, you might be particularly interested in that, because I know you're very interested in Marxism. Cool. So before we keep going on this very long but interesting tangent, I guess we can start with the next chapter. Chapter 13, analysis of the composite. Cool. So I guess I'll read a little bit of the commentary. The subject of this chapter is, according to Chandrakirti, what is samskrita. Literally, this word means made through coming together. That is composite or compounded. But there's an ambiguity here. This could mean something that is composite in the sense of being made of parts, like a chariot, or it could mean something that is produced through the coming together of a set of causes and conditions. So I think these two things are important to hold in mind, because it seems like a lot of the verses as well as the commentaries kind of refer to these two different ways of understanding compounded phenomena, whether composite in the sense of being made of parts, or something that is produced through the coming together of set of causes and conditions. So I'll continue. Buddhists all agree that anything that is composite in the first sense, made of parts, is not ultimately real, that it lacks intrinsic nature. But Abhidharmikas hold that while dharmas are composite in the second sense, in the sense of coming together from a set of causes and conditions, they are not composite in the first sense. And so, they claim, there is no difficulty holding that dharmas are ultimately real. Madhyamikas disagree. They claim that anything that is composite in the second sense is just as empty as something composite in the first sense. And since everything thought of as real is a product of causes and conditions, this means that everything is without intrinsic nature. Cool. So that's basically what we're analyzing here. This composition of things. So I will start with the first verse. The Blessed One said that whatever is deceptive in nature is vain, and that all composite things, being deceptive in nature, they are vain. And so the commentary basically points out that what's implicit here is also the view that nirvana, which is non-composite, is the only thing that's actually truly valuable and worth striving for, because all samsaric phenomena, being compounded, are impermanent and unreliable, and hence vain. And I have a bit of an open question on this, sort of just anticipating some of the future chapter, is how can we understand? So we have a difference. So samsaric phenomena are deceptive and compounded, but nirvana is not compounded, which makes it truly valuable. So there's that important distinction. But then at the same time, later on, we'll see that there is no difference between samsara and nirvana. And I'm very interested in thinking about how to think these two things together. I was about to say how to reconcile these two views of the distinctiveness and the identity of samsara and nirvana, but even reconciliation kind of assumes that there's like a problem in the first place. But there's probably I guess like we can say that the nature of samsara and nirvana are the same, that there's no difference between the two. But the way that this nature expresses themselves, there's an important distinction.
But then it would be a conventional distinction, a merely conventional.
Right.
So in other words, there's no ultimate distinction between samsara and nirvana. Right.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess the way we sort of understand that is through the two truths. Exactly. Conventionally.
Operating at the conventional level of truth, strive to attain nirvana, ultimately knowing that ultimately there is nothing to attain, like it says in the Heart Sutra, for example. I think this is the same thing pretty much as how one has to reconcile great compassion with Prajnaparamita. Like it says in the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 10,000 lines, Bodhisattva's great compassion involves having great compassion for beings while knowing that there are no beings.
Right.
Similarly, Bodhisattva's great striving for nirvana involves striving for nirvana while knowing that there's nothing to strive for. Or you might want to frame it as Bodhisattva's great desire for liberation from samsara happens while at the same time knowing that there is no samsara to be liberated from.
And what's also interesting is that there's no attainment, but there's also no non-attainment. So I like that double negation there as well. Which I think probably refers to this idea of like original awakening. Yeah, that we're in the sense that we're always already liberated in a sense, or even that like that deceptive phenomena merely obscure what's already functioning there as wisdom. So in that sense, there's no attainment or non-attainment. So verse 2 now. If the Buddhist statement, whatever is deceptive in nature is vain, is true, then what is there about which one is deceived? This was said by the Blessed One for the illumination of emptiness. So I wasn't sure exactly. Okay, no, so 3 is the objection. Never mind. Let me read a little bit from the commentary about verse 2. According to the Akutabaya, the question in 2ab is triggered by the fact that to say all composite things are deceptive in nature and vain is to say that they are not ultimately real. But in that case, there is nothing that is genuinely deceptive, nothing about which we are genuinely mistaken. So the Buddha must have been getting at a deeper point in saying this. And according to the Madhyamaka, this deeper point is that all composite things are empty or devoid of intrinsic nature. Actually, I'll keep reading because it's actually an interesting commentary. The Kutabaya has an opponent then object that in this sutra, the Buddha is not teaching the emptiness of all dharmas, but rather just the emptiness of the person. The person is not ultimately real, something with intrinsic nature, because it is composite in the first sense of being a whole made of parts. It is then vain because, being composite in this sense, it must be impermanent. This is an instance of a characteristic dispute between Abhidharma and Mahayana. Both agree that there are things that are empty or devoid of intrinsic nature, but they disagree as to what things are empty. The former teaches that the person is devoid of intrinsic nature, Pudgala Naratma. Did I say that right? And so it's not ultimately real, while the latter teaches that all things are empty or devoid of intrinsic nature, Dharma Naratma. And as Chandagirti points out, the opponent rejects the latter interpretation on the grounds that it leads to nihilism, the clear philosophy that nothing else would ever exist. It's interesting here. I mean, I guess I sort of qualified this already in the beginning, if I remember correctly. But it's interesting how they refer to Abhidharma as like something that we can compare against the Mahayana. Whereas I understood the Abhidharma to be a sort of category of, or like a genre of text that even the Mahayanas have.
But it's not just a genre, it's also the name for the movement that originated producing that genre of text. And that movement brought with it certain philosophical tendencies. So even though there are what we might call subversive Abhidharma genre type texts, of which we know that there were some, like for example, for example, Mahayana Sangraha, the commentaries on Asanga's Mahayana Sangraha mention a bunch of lost Mahayana Abhidharmas that were sort of subverting, creating texts in the same genre as Abhidharma, but subverting the philosophical tendencies maybe of the Abhidharma movement. I think that here, though, it's referring to the fact that the most of the Abhidharma texts we have reflect the tendencies of that movement that initiated the production of this genre of text, which involved substantialism about causality and about mereological simples and certain views about time and momentariness and so on.
Okay. Cool. It's also interesting that that Malcolm Smith, he also had emphasized at some point that that the Dzogchen text could be understood as a part of the Abhidharma genre, which is interesting.
That is, I mean, the origin, even before sort of these philosophical tendencies came about, the origin of Abhidharma literature was in creating pithy distillations of the many, many vast concepts found throughout the sutras, so that you could easily remember a kind of set of core instructions and turn those over in your mind and contemplate them without having to like sort through hundreds and hundreds of dialogue form texts to get to the instructions you wanted. And in that sense, I think you could definitely view a lot of Dzogchen texts as being similar to that in trying to sort of distill some pith out of what is otherwise present in vast quantities of pages of sutras.
Right, yeah. Quick random question. Did you, before the Buddhahood in this life, did you take the tantras without syllables?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Let's see. Oh, so now I'm gonna kind of read 3 and 4 together because they kind of go together. So 3, objection. For existence, there is a lack of intrinsic nature because they are seen to alter. There is no ultimately real existent that is without intrinsic nature due to the emptiness of existence. 4. Of what would there be alteration if intrinsic nature were not real? And then Nāgārjuna's reply would be, of what would there be alteration if intrinsic nature were real? Let's see, where right here. So the way I understood this, with the help of the commentary, of course, is that the opponent or our hypothetical interlocutor believes that something must be real in order for it to ground the change and alteration we do see. So there must be something that real that actually changes. But I guess Nāgārjuna's response would be, if intrinsic nature were real, then how could there be alteration? Which is an interesting response. So the opponent thinks that the phenomenon, the sort of alterations we're seeing, I guess might be unreal. So like the changes in a person who's only a merely composite phenomena who's conceptually dependent or conceptually imputed, but that there must be a basis of that which are real that grounds those changes, and that would be the real dharmas. But I guess if we understand the sort of consequence of intrinsic natures as basically making entities non-functional, non-relative, and non-dependent and non-relational, then there's no way we can think of ultimately real dharmas are actually grounding any kind of change, because ultimately real things kind of don't change as part of their nature. So I think I'm gonna skip a little for the interest of time, because we do have another chapter. Let's see. Cool. I think we can go see the last two verses, because that actually relates to something what we were bringing up about sort of controversy between Asanga and Bhavavika. I think if I remember correctly. 7. If something that is non-empty existed, then something that is empty might also exist. Nothing whatsoever exists that is non-empty. Then how will the empty come to exist? And so this basically seems to me clarifies what emptiness here actually is. It's not something that's ultimately real, but it's the ultimate reality of the phenomena that we're analyzing. So, yeah. And that's the commentary says, the Madhyamika does not claim that the emptiness of things is ultimately real. To say of things that they are empty is just to say that they are not ultimately real, and their not being ultimately real is not itself ultimately real. 8, emptiness is taught by the conquerors as the expedient to get rid of all metaphysical views. But those for whom emptiness is a metaphysical view have been called incurable.
Very famous verse.
Yeah, yeah. And I just love the sort of medical side of a lot of like Buddhist like teachings and analyses. I really admire that. I've seen one of the titles of the Buddha sometimes the Great Physician, which is like super cool.
And of course, there's also the Buddha who is called Vaishajya Guru, the medical teacher, the physician teacher Buddha Vaishajya Guru.
Is that medicine Buddha?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and it just goes to the point of like that the Buddha is not a metaphysician; he's a physician.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, practically oriented to alleviate our illness. Cool. Okay, chapter 14. So a lot more short. So confident we'll get through this before time runs out. Chapter 14, analysis of conjunction or contact. So I guess like the conjunction, that term conjunction comes up a lot, and I guess they're being close to the text, but it seems like we can also replace conjunction with contact or sparsha. I mean, that's basically what this chapter is about, right? the contact between the different elements of the dhatus. So I'll read the beginning of the commentary. Conjunction or contact is a relation that occurs between a sense, like a vision, and its object, such as color and shape, resulting in the arising of a consciousness, such as seeing a colored patch. The commentators represent the opponent as objecting to the arguments presented in the preceding chapter, saying that since the Buddha taught that the conjunction of the senses and their sense objects, there must be ultimately real things that come into contact with each other. And thus there must be things with intrinsic nature. It cannot be that all things are empty. The whole of this chapter is given over to Nāgārjuna's response to this objection. It is structured as a refutation of the possibility of conjunction being ultimately real. It kind of makes me think about like how like analyzing the different parts of the 12 links of dependent origination. It's almost like knowing that those parts are also not ultimately real is part of the process of getting out of that chain of dependence, which is interesting. Verse 1. The visible object, vision, and the seer, these three, whether in pairs or altogether, do not enter into conjunction with another. He's basically flat out saying, I think basically kind of a conclusion from the beginning again, that these different aspects of contact don't ever come into conjunction. They don't come into contact. The commentary states here, which helped clarify something for me, whether in pairs or all together. So according to the commentary, there are some ways of understanding contact as the sort of sense organ and sense object coming together and then giving rise to the sense consciousness. And there's other views that sort of see all three sort of coming together at the same time. But in Nāgārjuna's refutation of the reality of contact or conjunction applies to either scheme, whether you're seeing consciousness as arising from the conjunction of organ and object, or whether you're seeing them all come together at the same time. 2. So desire, the one who desires, and what is desirable should also be seen. Actually, I read that with the wrong tense. So desire, the one who desires, and what is desirable should also be seen. Likewise, the remaining defilements and the remaining ayatanas are to be seen by means of the threefold division of action, agent, and object. And the way I sort of understand part of this is that it's difficult to actually meaningfully and ultimately distinguish action, agent, and object. And as we'll see with the later on with the following verses, if you can't distinguish these different aspects, you can't say that there's any contact happening, because contact happens through distinguished things. So verse 3 sort of basically goes into that. Conjunction is of one distinct thing with another thing, and distinctiveness does not exist with respect to the visible object and the rest. Thus, they do not enter into conjunction. So the way I sort of understand this in almost like a basic syllogism is contact is between distinct things, but nothing is distinct. Therefore, there's no contact. Verse 4, and not only is there no distinctiveness of the visible object and the rest, so mutual distinctiveness of anything with something else is not possible. And I think what I see from this one, this is kind of a generalization to a lot of anything that we can understand as being able to be distinguished. Yeah, I'll read the commentary. The argument, which begins in the next verse, will generalize to the cases of all the ayatanas and defilements. Since in none of these cases can an action, agent, and object be ultimately distinct from one another, they cannot be ultimately in conjunction. So I'll read 5, 6, and 7 because they're grouped together here in this commentary. 5, what is distinct in dependence on that from which it is distinct. It is not distinct apart from that from which it is distinct. When X is dependent on Y, it does not hold that X is distinct from Y. 6, and this following sentence is key for me. If the distinct thing were distinct from that from which it is distinct, then it would be distinct even without that from which it is distinct. The distinct thing cannot be distinct without from which it is distinct, without that from which it is distinct. Hence, there is no distinctness. 7. Distinctness is not found in what is distinct, nor is it found in what is non-distinct. And distinctness is not being found. There can be neither the distinct nor the non-distinct. So, yeah, this is sort of, I think, an explanation of why some of these things, why we can't ground distinctiveness, because I guess if you have two things that are distinct from one another, but the nature of the distinctiveness only occurs relative to each other, you almost, at no point can you actually kind of establish one of the things as being distinguished from the other in order to ground the other as distinct. I think there was a very similar logical problem with another thing that we were analyzing before. Do you remember that? Maybe it was in prior and posterior parts. I'm slightly forgetting. It might come back to me. But I'm also interested, I kind of need a little bit of help with number 7. So distinctness is not found in what is distinct, nor is it found in what is non-distinct. And distinctness not being found, there can be neither the distinct nor the non-distinct. So the non-distinct here, I guess it means the same. Or it's like what's identical. Oh, okay, actually, now that I think about it, it's almost like for there to be identity at all, there has to be distinction. Because in order to identify something as identical with itself, it also has to be different from something else.
I think that's the argument.
Yeah. Cool. And the commentary says, in order to think of something as distinct, we must set that thing alongside other things, but that is just the mind's imaginative power that does it. At 8, we have the return of one of our favorites, the 3 times argument. It is not correct to say that conjunction is of this with itself, nor that there is conjunction of this with another. The presently being conjoined, the conjoined, and that which conjoins, none of these exist. And I'll read the commentary. That conjunction would have to either involve a thing taken separately from all else, or else be between things that are mutually distinct. I should read the first part of that sentence. The argument of 8AB is, according to the Akutubaya, the conjunction would have to either involve a thing taken separately from all else, or else be between things that are mutually distinct. As was just argued, for two things to be mutually distinct from one another, they must be brought into a relation of mutual dependence. The pot is distinct from the cloth only in dependence on the cloth being distinct from the pot. Since two things in a relationship of mutual dependence cannot be ultimately distinct, and conjunction requires distinct things, conjunction is not possible on this hypothesis. The alternative is to consider the pot without reference to the cloth. But for there to be conjunction, there must be two distinct things. Conjunction cannot be between a thing and of itself, a thing and itself. Hence, conjunction cannot be ultimately real. So I think that was a kind of much more simple chapter. You guys have any other comments on that before we talk about what we'll read for the next chapter, the next session? Okay, cool. So the next chapter is actually pretty juicy. It's an analysis of intrinsic nature. So really getting to the root of what's being refuted here and denied here. So it's important that we read that. Then chapter 16 is analysis of bondage and liberation. Let's see. Actually, it looks like going from 15 to 17, that would be a lot of reading, relatively speaking, from what we have been doing. We've been doing 20 pages on average. 15 to 17 will be 40 pages. So I think to even it out, we could probably do 2 for next session. And then following that, we can go by 3s. And then that would give us like 4 sessions up. So yeah, 15 and 16. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Cool. All right, thanks guys. And I'll see you next week, hopefully. So we're reading 15 and 16. All right, bye.
Thank you very much. I tried I put that link. I mean, DOI of that link that you put in the chat on that page. You know, which we usually use for these things, and I couldn't get the article.
Oh, I think if you look up the author, I think Elisa Louise Lange, however you pronounce that. I think if you look her name up and you find her academia.edu, you'll be able to find the article. Yeah. And if you still have trouble, let me know and I'll figure out, because I want to read it too at some point again. Okay, all right, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you very much. Bye.